So that's something, losing focus, as many of you mentioned. And of course, getting the spelling and grammar right. So I think that one of the things that we need to do as teachers is to be aware of these, to consider carefully which of these apply to our students, and to think about what we can do to help our students in some of these areas. And that's what we're going to do today. Three things we're going to look at in this listening section is, first of all, using time wisely. And I really do think that that is the most important thing that you can teach your students to do. Knowing when to read, knowing when to listen, knowing when to write, getting it all coordinated so that their time is used to the best possible advantage on test day. Also, we're going to have a look at some practical classroom ideas for dealing with distractors and making your students more comfortable and competent when they listen to different accents and connected speech. Okay, so that's the order we're going to look at things in. I'm going to pause for a moment and go over to Rubina. Hello, Rubina. Are you there?
Yeah.
Hi. Have we got any questions at this stage in the Q&A that you'd like me to have a think about? Anything that is connected to the format or the major problems or anything like that?
No questions, Andrew, so far.
Okay.
They seem to be
okay, we'll come back to you in a moment, Rubina. Thank you for that. Don't forget,
sure.
If you've got any questions about anything that I'm talking about, please type your question in the Q&A section, not the chat box. The chat box is for you to talk to each other and to do exercises. And we'll stop from time to time and try and answer some of your questions. Okay, so I think the first thing that you need to consider when teaching listening skills is that there are three things you need to consider as a teacher. First of all, what is the student or what are the students going to be doing before they listen to the recording? Secondly, what are the students going to be doing while they're listening to the recording? And finally, are you going to ask them to do anything after they've listened to the recording? So I think these are things that you need to consider as a teacher. And it's going to be different depending on your learning aims or learning objectives. For example, what we would generally try to encourage students to do before they listen is to understand the context of the listening. How do you think that they can understand the context? Can you put your answers in the chat? What can students look at, or what can we ask students to look at to understand something about the context of the listening? What can we ask them to do? Keywords, says Nikita. By reading, says Prabita, keywords. A lot of people are saying title, keywords, theme of the context, heading. Yeah, all of these things are great strategies. We need to get them to really try and find out as much about what they're about to listen to as they possibly can. Got a technical term here for you next, activating schemata, which basically is about getting students to think about their existing knowledge. If, for example, the listening is about two students in a university library, what do they know about libraries? What do they know about universities? What do they know about students? Just getting them to think about those things, those vocabulary items, that language that they already know, getting that to the front of their active memory. I think predicting content is one of the best ways to use the time in the listening test as efficiently as possible. We're going to have a look at that in a bit of detail in a moment. And of course, making sure that they know that they need to read the instructions, understand the instructions very well. Okay, so that's what you might consider doing before listening. During listening, Well, I think it depends if you're training them to improve their listening skills or if you are giving them test practice. And I think the approach is different. And I think we as teachers need to be aware of what our learning aims are. Are we training our students to develop their listening skills? Or are we giving them practice in IELTS test technique? So it's going to be different for every teacher, in every lesson, in every activity. But that's what you need to think about. Am I trying to develop my students' listening skills here? Or am I providing them with IELTS test practice? So think about that very carefully and make sure that the activities that you do in class match with your learning aims. Here's some ideas of things you could do after listening. You could show them the recording transcript. There are all sorts of advantages to that. We'll talk about some in a moment. You could ask them to assess each other. You can discuss and analyze errors, and you can develop strategies to overcome those errors. So all of those things you can think about. But I think the basic framework is consider when you're teaching what you're doing before the listening, what you're doing or what the students are doing during the listening, and what happens after the listening. I think that's fairly basic things to consider when you are teaching or practicing listening skills. Okay, so let's move on to think about some listening strategies, and then we'll have a look at some examples, and I'll ask you to do some exercises. Okay, so prediction and looking at keywords are extremely important, and this is very much connected to using time wisely. Also, being aware of synonyms and antonyms, I think you need to develop your students' abilities to recognize those in listening texts, making sure that they focus on what's important and they keep moving forward, that they don't get stuck on one question and so they miss the answers to the next 5 questions that come up in the listening. So all of those, I think, are important listening strategies that we can use with our IELTS students. So let's have a look at an example here. And this is a note completion exercise taken from a listening test that I've come up with. So what we need to do here is to, first of all, just by looking at it, what's it about? What is this all about? Can you type your answer into the chat box now, please? This listening, what's it all about? Conference, we've got here, yeah, conference, a paid conference. Everyone's saying a conference, yeah. So excellent. That is the first thing that you need to get your students to do as quickly as they possibly can. And I mean, anything that you do in class should be enabling them to quickly identify what they're going to be listening about. And all of you, I can see the answers are still coming in. All of you got that extremely quickly, that it's about a conference. Okay, the next thing that you want your students to be able to do quickly and efficiently is to predict what some of the answers are going to be. So let's have a look at, for example, question number 2. Question number 2 is going to be what? If you type your answer, it's going to be a digit, says Lena. Yes, an amount, says Jaya. A number, says Sampri. Yes, absolutely. It's going to be a number. So we want our students to be able to identify these things. Of course, number 4 is also going to be a number, and number 5 also, and number 9 also, and possibly number 10. So they know that they have to listen for a number when those keywords in the recording related to those parts of the test come up. Okay, what about number 3? That's a slightly more tricky one. What do you think number 3 might be? Advance, before, in advance? Yeah, The time? Yeah, absolutely. So again, it doesn't have to be simply a number. You can get them to predict what sort of information is going to go in there. And this is all about activating their schemata. What they know, they don't need to know in detail about international conferences, but they need to know that you maybe pay, you maybe travel there and stay in a guest house or other accommodation. So these general knowledge elements are the sort of things that you want to focus your students' attention on. So I would spend quite a lot of time in class doing these types of exercises before playing any listening recording. Get them to look at the question items and to predict as closely as possible what they think the answer is going to be. Is it going to be a number? Is it going to be a name? I think also here you need to think about, when are they doing this? When do they listen? When do they read? When do they write? All of this multitasking can be very difficult for students. And I think you need to remember that you need to be training them to use techniques which avoid cognitive overload. When there's too much going on, listening and reading and writing, and they can't do it all at the same time. And so they lose focus. So any techniques that you can give them to deal with that are going to be really very helpful. I think one piece of advice that I always give my students is, don't pay too much attention to the part on the recording when it says, now you have 30 seconds to check your answers. I don't think that's the most efficient use of their time. The most efficient use of their time is to look forward to the next set of questions and to predict what they need to listen for when that recording starts. And there are lots of these little breaks in the IELTS listening test. There's a little bit of time beforehand. There's a little bit of time after each of the recordings. And in the last recording, recording 4, that's often split into 2. So there's a little bit of time between the first and the second part of recording number 4. So we need to be training our students to know when the time is to read, when the time is to listen and write. And I think that can be very helpful and very important. So do make them aware of the pattern of skills usage that they should be using. Now you're reading. Now you're thinking. Now you're listening. Now you're listening and writing. All of those things. Also, once they've heard the last answer in any particular section, they don't need to listen to the remainder of the recording because they've already heard the last answer. And sometimes this last answer comes maybe 2 or even 3 sentences before the end of the recording. So that's again some valuable seconds that they can use to look at the next set of questions. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about the importance of predicting, trying to think about what type of answer that they're listening for, and then listening for that specific information? If you do have any questions, I'll pause for 30 seconds now, and you can type them into the Q&A box. And Rubina will relay them to me.
We have a couple of questions coming in, Andrew.
Yes.
The first question is, how does one take care of distractors while attempting the listening test?
Okay. So we're going to come on to that as our next part of this webinar. So I won't answer that one now because that's the next thing we're going to look at.
Great. Right. My next question is, how does one train the students for multitasking for a listening test?
Could you repeat that, please, Rubina? I didn't quite hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, the next question is, how can they train their students for multitasking while they attempt the listening test?
Okay, so I think it's just a question of trying to avoid multitasking whenever possible, as I said. Make sure you as a teacher are very, very familiar with the listening test so you know when the recording stops, when you have that 10-second break, when you have that 30-second break. And then you need to train them what they must do during those pauses in the recording. And I think you need to divide it between this is the time you should be reading and thinking. This is the time you should be listening and writing. And I think that if you're able to do that and students say, right, the recording stopped, I've got 30 seconds, now I should be looking at the next set of questions and thinking, predicting the stuff I need to listen out for in the next part of the listening section. I think one very good way of really getting your head around it, which I have done 2 or 3 times, most recently I think about 3 years ago, is to take an IELTS test. Then you will really get a personal experience of what your students have to face. Let's just see if anyone's done that. In the chat box, could you just type yes if you have taken an IELTS test? Oh, lots of people saying yes. Yes. Lots of people saying yes. Excellent. I think it really is the best way to get some sort of personal experience that you can then pass on to, oh, someone got an 8.5. Oh, every 2 years? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when I took it, and I'm sure you, as teachers, when you took it, we're not really interested so much in the band score, although that might be interesting. But I do think it's really valuable to understand what the students face during an IELTS test. It gives you that sort of personal insight, which is valuable. Any other questions, Rubina, on predicting multitasking?
Not on predicting and multitasking, but there is one common question that keeps recurring. It's what are the different accents that they should be familiar with for the listening test?
Well, that is what we're going to be looking at in the last part of this listening webinar. So I'm not going to say too much about that now.
Fair enough.
Okay, so we'll come back to you in a few minutes for some more questions, Rubina. And please, if you've got any questions about IELTS listening, do type them into the Q&A box and we'll deal with them in a moment. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is synonyms. And it's very important that your students understand that what they see in the test booklet, the questions, they'll have the same meaning perhaps, but will not necessarily use the same words as they hear in the recording. And it's important to alert your students to this and train them to listen out for synonyms. Have a look at this extract from an IELTS listening test, for example. And have a look at question 6. Which describes swimming ability. The listening is all about getting a membership at a college swimming club. I'm not going to play you the recording, but just to give you some context. So, question 6 asks them to identify the swimming ability that the speaker talks about. Does she or he say that they can't swim, they're a non-swimmer, beginner, average, very good, or league? Now, even if your students don't know the meaning of league, they can see that it's on a scale going from not very good to very good and above. So league must be above very good. So help them to understand things like that. Also, on the recording, these are very likely to be paraphrased. The speakers are likely to use synonyms. Rather than saying non-swimmer, they might say, I can't swim. Other synonyms might be used for beginner, average, very good, and league. So let's see what you think and see if you are on your toes. What possible synonyms do you think might be used in the recording for beginner? So type in the chat box now, please. What do you think beginner? Amateur, we've got premature, novice, starter, just started. novice, first time, all of these things. Yes, yeah, excellent. So this is the sort of thing that we can encourage our students to do. What about average? What might they say instead of average? You type okay, Sonny is saying, okay, Jaya is saying, moderate, Justjeet is saying, yeah, casual, some experience, know a little bit, quite good, excellent, excellent. In fact, the words that they used on this particular recording was middling, meaning average. So I think this is another very useful thing in terms of prediction and time management, using time wisely, that we can ask our students to do, is to try and identify questions that may feature synonyms on the recordings and to think about what sort of synonyms or paraphrases may be used. Again, this is all about activating the schemata, getting them thinking about different words that may be used to describe beginner, to describe average, etc., etc., etc. Now, although it's taken me perhaps a minute to explain that, this is a process that students should be doing mentally and very quickly. And the better your students are at all of these mental thinking processes, the easier they'll find it to get a good score on the IELTS listening. So being aware of what sort of answer they should be listening for and being aware of some of the possible synonyms or paraphrases that they might hear on the recording related to that answer. So we've got a few comments in the chat here. Yeah, you can, Justneed says we can predict answers about the demand of the question. Yes, it's different for every question. Some questions are going to be quite easy to predict what sort of answer will be there. Some will be more difficult. But this is a good technique to try to do anyway. Sometimes I think you're going to say, well, it's difficult to predict that answer, even the type of answer. But making an educated guess is always good. Yes, Simranjit says making a guess with a grammar check. Yeah, also thinking about what the grammar is telling us about what type of word or phrase needs to go into the space. Some people are saying prediction can always also confuse. Well, what you need to be careful of is they don't say, right, I think that answer number 4 is biology, and so I'm only listening for biology. What they need to be thinking is, I think that answer number 4 is the name of a course. So I need to be listening out for the name of a course or something that sounds like it's the name of a course. So they're not trying to predict the answer. They're trying to predict the type of answer that they may hear, and that will give them important information about what they need to listen out for on the recording. Don't forget that probably 75–80% of that recording does not contain any answers. Only about 20, maybe 25% of it, whatever the percentages are. A very small amount of the total recording contains the answers. So anything we can do to get them listening out for those answers very carefully is going to be very useful. Okay, let's move on to think about distractors. So have a look through this dialogue, and I'd like you to tell me how many distractors there are. Normally you wouldn't be reading this. Normally in a listening test you'd be listening to this, but have a look through it. How many distractors do you think there are? And can you please type that into the chat box? Okay, dates. Yeah, 2 distractors. Yeah, 20th, all of those dates. Yeah, you're seeing them. Excellent. Yeah, well done. Yeah. Dates, it's all those dates. So we've got the 21st of July, then we've got the 20th, the 19th, 18th, 19th. So in answer to the question, when will they leave? What is the answer, actually? Can you type that into the chat box? When do they want to leave? What date? When will they leave? The 18th, says Dr. Rahman. 18th, says Asha. Yes, the 18th. So what we need to do is to train our students about these distractors. First of all, we need to make them aware that these distractors exist. Yeah? So awareness raising is the first step. So let's have a look at a couple of activities that you could maybe use with your students to raise awareness of the distractors. First of all, you can identify what different types of distractors there might be. So first of all, there's suggestions. So someone might say, oh, why don't we go to the Korean restaurant? And then someone might say, well, we could go to the Korean restaurant, but I'd prefer to go to the Japanese restaurant. So when there's a suggestion that isn't taken by someone, that can be distracting. People often correct mistakes. They say things like, oh, I'll see you at 11 o'clock. Oh, no, wait a minute. I've got a meeting at 11 o'clock. I'll see you at 11:30. So correcting mistakes. And the speaker changes their mind. There might be a particular word that's in the question, but which when you hear it on the recording, that is not the correct answer. This particularly happens in multiple choice questions. So first of all is to think about the different types of distractors that are used in IELTS and to make your students aware of them and to show them examples of them as well. So awareness raising is something that we as IELTS teachers need to be doing. Let's have a look at an exercise that you could use in order to do this. Let's go through them one by one. Oh, sorry, I've gone forward too much there. There we go. We've got 4 possible distractors here. Okay, so have a look again at the type of distractors. A suggestion, a mistake, someone changing their mind, or a particular word. Have a look at number 1. What type of distractors do you think students might hear in the recording for this question? Could you type your answers into the chat box now, please? Lots of people typing time. Yeah, first date, time. Time, says Kavita. Time, says Shruti. Yeah, next meeting. Yeah, lots of, yeah, exactly. You're spot on. You're on the ball. You're getting it right. That's great. Yes, so students should be aware that in a question like that, it's quite likely that they might hear several times and or dates, and they should be aware that some of those are distractors. Okay, next one. Which restaurant do they decide to eat at? What sort of distractors do you think they might hear, that you might find here in the recording? The location, yeah, the name of the restaurant, the venue, yeah, all of those things. Excellent. Lots and lots of answers coming through in the chat. Thank you very much for that. I do appreciate it. Okay, how about the next one? The students have decided to do a project about project details, the project topic coming through on the chat, the courses, the subject, the detail, absolutely. And finally, number 4, the major problems. First, the weather. What next? Another problem. Yeah, that's quite right. Another problem, I think, is something that you would expect to be there. So the point here is that do exercises like this one with your students in class. Give them a selection of IELTS listening questions and question types and get them to think about what possible distractors might be thrown in. And of course, you never know. but being aware that there might be distractors, and if there are distractors, what type of distractors they might be is very useful for students, because that can help them to avoid those distractors during their test. So does anyone at this point, I'm going to stop again for a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any questions about what you can do to help your students to identify and avoid distractors? If you do, please type them into the Q&A now, please. And Rubina, if any are coming in, please select a couple for me to answer.
Sure, Andrew. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that came in before, and most of them have been asking you for some tips and suggestions on how they can help their students follow and answer questions which are either MCQs or based on maps.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay. Well, I think that we're not looking at specific task types in this webinar,
right.
but MCQ questions and map questions also contain distractors. So in future webinars, we can look at specific listening task types, but unfortunately, that's outside the scope of this particular webinar. Maybe we can deal with some of those questions in the general Q&A, which we'll have after the last section of my talk. Are there any questions connected to specifically what I've been talking about at the moment, Rubina?
None at the moment, Andrew, but one question that seems to be coming up quite often is they want to know if there is any difference in the kinds of distractors that are used in the different sections of the listening test.
Okay. No, any of these distractors might appear in any one of the recordings. And I think the one where someone corrects themselves really could appear in any of the recordings, for example. So they're not section or part, as it's called now, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. They're not part specific. They could crop up at any time. And not necessarily will every single recording contain a distractor. I mean, I think what we need to do is to get students to think about the type of question that's likely to include a distractor. When they listen, maybe note down all of the possible answers, including the distractors, and then cross out the distractors. That can be quite effective. And if you want to do some work in class, if a student's got a question wrong because of a distractor, I think it's quite important to focus on that. Why did they get that question wrong? Why did the distractor distract them? And I think all of these are things that we should be doing all the way through when we're teaching listening skills. Whenever distractors come up, we should briefly focus on them and give our students strategies such as the one that we've just talked about for dealing with them. Okay, moving on to the last part of this listening section, and then we'll have time for more general questions and answers for 10 minutes or so. And this section is all about dealing with accents and dealing with connected speech. Connected speech is how native speakers speak when they are speaking at a normal rate, or indeed how an IELTS Band 9 or Band 8 speaks when they are performing very well in the speaking test. And I'd like to begin with this quote from a long time ago, 1987, from the IELTS Journal by Sheerin. Just have a read through it. Give you 30 seconds to read the quote. Okay, so I think this is something that we need to consider. I mean, you can see how old this is. He talks about tapes are played. Obviously, we just use recordings digitally mostly nowadays. But what you as IELTS teachers, or me as an IELTS teacher, I think we have to be quite careful that we are not just spending classroom time testing listening, but that we are spending valuable classroom time teaching listening skills and strategies. This doesn't mean that we can't use IELTS material, practice exercises, practice tests when we're teaching listening. But if you just put on the recording, they do it, right or wrong answers, that's not teaching listening, that's testing listening. And I think that's something that we need to make sure that we don't do all the time. And certainly when you're thinking about helping learners to understand accents and connected speech, testing listening isn't really going to work that effectively. And also, I think this is an interesting one from much more recently, the false belief that continuous practice in coping, Caldwell calls it hope to cope, is the only way to teach listening. It's not. So be aware of giving too much listening practice where you're hoping they're going to get a bit better each time they do it because they've done it so many times. And you just keep giving them those IELTS listening exercises in class to practice on. That's not the best way to do it. You need to be aware of what your students are finding difficult and then help them to come up with strategies for addressing those problems as they relate to the IELTS exam. And one of the best ways to do it is to make sure that they listen to a range of accents. In the IELTS exam, you will hear British accents, you will hear American accents, you will hear Australian accents, New Zealand accents, you'll hear Canadian accents, and increasingly, you'll hear accents that people who are not native speakers of English have. For example, a Polish person speaking English, or a German person speaking English, or a Brazilian person, or a Spanish person speaking English. So all of these, there's a range of different accents. It's an international exam, so that's only, test rather, so that's only right that you should hear a range of accents. All of these radio sites and TV sites that are at the top of the screen, BBC, RNZ, etc., have a look at these. They all have podcasts, live streaming, news programs, all sorts of free material, which you can either use in class or direct your students to use outside class. Also, of course, TED Talks and YouTube are great for listening to a range of different accents. And this is very much familiarization. The more your students listen to different accents, the more comfortable they will be with different accents. Maybe if they go on YouTube, they can use closed captioning or subtitles to help them initially. Maybe they can search on some of these BBC, CNN sites for simplified versions of the news or captioned news or transcripts of programs, etc., etc. But without going into a great deal of detail now, it's very important for you to expose your students to a range of accents so that they are familiar with different speakers of English in the IELTS listening test. Just before we finish this listening section then, I'd like to show you an activity which is quite fun and could help your students with listening to connected speech. So if I say 3 words to you and I don't use connected speech, it will sound like this: apples and pears. Okay, I'll say it once more. Apples and pears. However, if I say that same phrase using connected speech, listen to it now. Apples and pears. Apples and pears. So in fact, I'm not saying apples and pears anymore. I'm actually saying apple zum pears. That's how it sounds in connected speech. And I think it's quite a good idea to introduce your students to the concept of connected speech which will help them to understand what they hear in the IELTS listening. I'm going to show you one example of an activity you can use. But first of all, let me explain what actually happens. So when I say apples and pears in normal speed connected speech, first of all, the z sound, apples, the z at the end of apples moves to the next word. In this case, the word is and. So the z at the end of apple moves to and. That's called a consonant move. Also, and becomes very, very short because I've cut the d sound. I've cut the n sound in the middle. Finally, there's a consonant change. At the end, I don't pronounce the phoneme d, I pronounce the phoneme m, apples and pears. So these are the three things which happen to that expression when it features in connected speech. So I'm going to show you a brief activity that you can use in class now to help your students with this. And what I'd like you to think about is not necessarily whether it's a consonant move, consonant cut, or consonant change, but what is the expression that we're looking at? So let me share my screen with the activity. Okay, here we go. So what you need to do is to write the expression that you think features in transcribed connected speech on the screen. Let's have a look. Okay, so in connected speech, the expression is salt and pepper. How would you write that? How would you write that in normal English? Salt and pepper, everyone is saying. Yes, exactly. But when we say it in connected speech, it becomes salt and pepper because of all those consonant shifts and elisions and things. Yeah. I mean, another good way, excellent, everyone's got it right. Another good way if someone doesn't hear something on a listening, show it to them written down so that they can make that link between the word they know and what they heard on the listening. I remember when I was teaching IELTS a few years ago, one of my students said to me, "Sir, what's festival? What is festival? F-E-S-T-I-V-A-L, festival." And I said, "Oh, well, you know, festival, it's like a celebration. It can be a time when families get together, like, for example, Christmas or Diwali or Ramadan or something like this." And he said, "Yeah, okay, I thought that's what it meant. But why do you always say festival at the start of our IELTS lesson?" And I thought, well, I don't always say festival at the start of the IELTS lesson. I was saying first of all, first of all. Only I wasn't. I was saying, first of all, let's look at this today. And he thought I was saying festival. So writing something down and showing this is the written form, yeah, that's how it looks. But in fact, when people are speaking at a normal speed, this is how it sounds. I think that's a very important lesson that we can teach our students. Okay, let's have a look at one or two more. Let's spin the wheel again. Okay, so there you go. In the chat box, yes, 6 eggs, everyone's got it. But when we say it in connected speech, it's 6 eggs. Can you get me 6 eggs? 6 eggs, please. Okay, right. So there's an idea that you can use to help your learners cope with connected speech. As I said, highlight the difference between the written form and the spoken sound of the word, and maybe use a spinner activity of this kind and get your students thinking about consonant shifts and elision and things like that. You can make activities like this if you look at this website, Word Wall. I don't know if any of you have used Word Wall. It's an excellent website for creating classroom activities that learners can use with you in the class or they can use at home. So do have a look at Word Wall. Very flexible resource for a whole range of different activities. Okay, so let me just recap. In this listening section, we thought about ways to use the time wisely and how we need to train our learners when they should be reading, when they should be listening, when they should be thinking, when they should be writing, making sure that you have a really clear knowledge of when the recording stops for 30 seconds in terms. Someone's saying, can you type the link here? If you just type into Google, Neha, if you type wordwall.com, wordwall, W-O-R-D-W-A-L-L, as it sounds, wordwall.com. Let me type, yeah, wordwall.com. Just have a search, you'll find it. It's a great resource. Yes, that's it, wordwall.com. So we talked about using the time wisely, how it's important to train our learners to think about what they are doing at what point in the listening test, how they should be predicting, thinking about synonyms. All of those things are going to help them to listen out for the most correct answers. Also, we need to make them aware about distractors and how to identify and avoid them, and also give them some strategies for finding it easier to listen to different accents and to native speakers speaking in connected speech. So we've got, let's give ourselves, or let's see, Rubina, do we have any questions that people want to ask in the Q&A at the moment?
No, Andrew, I think there are questions, but they are more to do with the specific task types.
Okay.
And there's one more question, sorry,
Yeah.
which is a recurring one. They would like to know how do they answer when there are dates and time as an answer? Do they answer in numbers? Do they answer in words? And if
Well,
with
I
that
think, yeah, this is another thing that I mentioned briefly, but which is, of course, incredibly important, is that it's all there in the instructions. The instructions will always be crystal clear. So if it says 2 words and or a number, then only 2 words and or a number. So if it's a time, for example, have a look at the instruction. It'll say, if it's possible to use a number, it will say and or a number. If they don't want you to use a number, they will just say words. So it's the instructions that you need to look at, and you need to train students to look at those instructions very carefully and follow them. I think also with numbers, it's maybe worth drilling numbers even to quite advanced students of IELTS, because things like 30 and 13, 20, 40 and 14, these are things that often come up, and they're put in there to be tricky. So make sure that your students really do know how to understand and to spell, etc., numbers in English. And the alphabet as well. Things are often spelled out, and it may seem very basic, but they need to be confident that they can write down a word when it's spelled out quite quickly for them. Anything else, Rubina?
no, Andrew.
Okay, so that was IELTS listening. Very, very quick. Of course, we could spend a whole day talking about IELTS listening. And, you know, I'm sorry that we haven't been able to look at specific task types within the scope of this webinar. But, you know, if you'd like additional webinars that focus on specific listening task types, then please get in touch with IDP, and I'm sure they will see what they can do. Also, if you have any more general questions that you didn't think of now, then you can maybe ask them when we come back for part 2. So part two this afternoon is, let me find the screen for you, just a moment.